The Solitaire Series, Episode 11, The Eight of Clubs, by Troy Lambert. Narrated by Troy Lambert. Janice glared at the black man in the red suit with the big top hat wearing the wine-colored scarf. She slipped the 100 he'd tossed her way into her pocket anyway. Perks of the job, free drinks from assholes who hit on her because she was pretty, and an occasional 100 or more from some gambler who was doing well, even if she had asked him for help. That had been a pretense, of course. She wanted information from him, and he seemed to be an easier target than the scarred man who'd left the club with him. Jack, he'd called him? Sounded right. And normally a man like Red Hat would stop for her when she asked him for help, but she'd seen him come out of the club once and then be escorted back inside. Janice wondered what that was about. She knew this place had a game going on. The jerk who just threw money at her and his scarred friend from earlier certainly hadn't been inside for the music, and she hadn't seen them bellied up to the bar or sitting on the couches, where the old dudes usually watched the young chicks like her dance. Lord knew what they did with themselves, but she'd rather be spared that knowledge. No, there was a back room filled with high-stakes gamblers. She wanted in, not because she was a gambler herself, but because it was her job. The bouncers had kicked her out because maybe she'd been a bit too flirtatious, and certainly flipping off the one-way mirror at the top of the stairs hadn't been a brilliant move, except if your intent was to see what kind of attention that got you. Her plan had worked. There was someone up there, someone important. Her success meant getting back inside, which should be pretty easy. First, she slipped her phone from her pocket and dialed a number. "Come get me," was all she said. A mere 30 seconds later, a sedan with a lift light pulled up to the curb and she slid in the back seat. "What happened?" The driver barely glanced at her in the mirror. "I got kicked out, so I need to change. Drive around the block." The car moved away from the curb and out of the parking lot. At her feet was a black duffel bag, and she pulled it onto the seat and unzipped it. Removing the red wig she had on, she ran her hand over her own dark hair, shaved close to her skull, not too sweaty, and the tape was still in place. She tossed the wig aside and selected a blonde one instead, one with longer hair. She set it in place, securing it. Janice pulled the black dress over her head and tossed it aside too. The car swerved as it switched lanes quickly and then came to a sudden stop. "Sorry," the driver said over his shoulder. Her eyes met his in the rear view. "Eyes on the road," she told him. "There's nothing for you to see back here." He snorted laughter, but his eyes moved back to the front and returned his focus to driving. She selected a blue number, low cut, one that would be short on her, and pulled it on. She selected some platform heels, what her boss called her stripper shoes, but their real purpose was to add a few inches to her height. She set them on the seat. Then she took out a mirror, wiped off the makeup she'd been wearing, applied some moisturizer, and went for a new look. This time she added more blush, highlighting her cheekbones and adding more eyeshadow, making her look older and even more mature. When that was done, she straightened the wig one last time. Her target would be different this time, not the young boys in the club, but the men passing through to the back room. And she'd be looking to avoid the attention of security now that she knew someone big was watching. That's whose attention she really wanted. "Get me back in there," she told the driver. "Yes, ma'am," he said. A few minutes later, they drove back into the parking lot, pulled into the Circle Drive, and the valet who had looked down on her when she got kicked out of the club opened her door for her. She swung her feet out, slipped on the heels, and stood. "Ma'am?" the driver said. She turned her head to look at him, and he pointed at her rear. She felt back there, realizing her dress was partially tucked into her underwear, and she pulled it out, smoothing it over her ass and the back of her legs. Damn bullshit, getting dressed in the back seat. She heard laughter from the direction of the driver, but slammed the door, turned, and walked inside, carrying a tiny black purse that contained everything she needed. She found it funny that the same security guard who had escorted her out less than an hour before stood aside as she came in and then checked her out as she went by. Asshole. But she smiled anyway and headed for the bar. This seemed to be the place where men headed to the back room and the games there passed by, and she bet she could make one of them stop either on the way in or, if he won big, on the way out. This was Vegas. There was nothing illegal about gambling, so there was no reason to hide it unless you were an organization with predatory practices. Even though the odds favored the house, the games still had to be fair. Also, lending money at exorbitant rates and collecting payments with violent tactics when gamblers didn't pay was illegal. Organizations in Vegas ran the gambit, from high-stakes poker and blackjack tables to sports betting. And gambling law is no simple thing to understand. Illegal gambling as a business is federally forbidden, but states and other gaming commissions actually determine what is allowable in their states and what isn't. When it comes to the legal arenas like financing and fair play, there are several jurisdictions that matter, including criminal and constitutional law and sometimes even competition law. In cases like this one, in Vegas, task forces were usually organized by the Nevada Gaming Commission and the FBI in cooperation. That made Janice's job a hard one. She went undercover, gathered evidence, always aware it was very possible that not a shred of it would be relevant, and she'd have to gather more, different evidence, or in some cases, start her investigation all over again. This was her third year operating in Vegas, about 2 years longer than the average agent lasted in her position, but she had several things going for her. Her military training meant she was in great shape and able to handle herself without backup in most situations. She was also a master of disguise, had no family to speak of, so nothing really going on at home. She didn't even have a cat or a goldfish. Her boss described her as the perfect agent. She described herself as a cold-blooded bitch out for justice. Her bosses knew about her father, his addiction, and his death, but she passed her psyche evals and her skills were off the charts, so they let her come here conditionally. She hadn't taken a vacation since, and always stayed just inside the line of what she was and was not allowed to do. She perched on a bar stool and checked out the room. The music still thumped, lasers danced across the floor, and bodies writhed in time with the beat. Some of the guys she'd been dancing with glanced her way, but not a single one came over. She no longer looked like their type. "Drink?" the bartender asked. "Vodka martini, extra dirty," she told him. "Coming up." The door she wanted to get through was set into the wall at the back of the club, and a single guard stood watch next to it. A magnetic pad on the wall required a key card to open it. While she'd never been on the other side, she would bet there were guards there too, as much to watch the game and gamblers as to watch for unauthorized entry. No one could get in or stay inside the game without being invited. She watched with interest while a man in a white suit approached the door. He said something to the guard, probably a password, then the guard used a card to open the door and let him pass. She couldn't see a thing through the small crack that appeared. Her order arrived, and she took a long drink. "Thanks," she said. "It's on the house," the bartender said. "Double thanks," she said, instantly more alert and cautious. "I'm Chase," a man from behind her said a second later. "What can we do to make your stay here more pleasant?" Janice turned to find a man in a tuxedo, but an inexpensive one. It wasn't as cheap as the cologne that clogged her nostrils with his every move. She allowed a smile to cross her lips, and then looked over his shoulder at the door with the guard next to it. "What's in there?" "That's a private area of the club for members only," he told her. "How do I become a member?" "You'd have to talk to the boss." "Is he available?" Chase smiled at her. "I can check. In the meantime—" "I'll wait." "Ma'am, I'll wait." Janice crossed her legs and felt her skirt right up on her thighs. The jerked gaze followed the action, and he licked his lips. Actually, licked his lips. She wanted to kick his teeth in, knock a few molars loose and down his throat. Maybe he would bite off the tip of his tongue and she could toss it into the crowd. But instead, she smiled and folded her arms over her chest. "Okay, His voice stumbled, and the cheap tuxedo-wearing flunky turned away. He pulled a cell phone from his pocket and spoke into it briefly. She looked up at the one-way mirror and winked. Surely whoever was up there would be looking by now. Chase turned back to her. He looked a little pale, and a tick under his eye told her he was nervous. "Come with me," he said. Janice stood and smoothed her dress downward, tucked her purse under her arm, and followed. Her escort was taller than her, but not by much. He was rail thin, though, probably somebody at the top son, really not suited for this work, but given assignments like her, so he felt important and a part of the team. He probably hoped to inherit his father's business, but he never would. Weak, subservient, traits probably beat into him from a young age by one parent or another, or passed along genetically. Who knew? Either way, Janice had him pegged pretty quickly. As long as he could get her close to the leaders who mattered, that was all she cared about. They passed the door in the wall where the guard stood, and he smiled at her. She knew the shoes she wore made her ass look amazing, mainly because her glutes were as sore as if she'd done 100 lunges. She let him look as she walked by, wanting to remove his eyes, but instead keeping her focus on the prize. She'd had small victories as an agent, but what she craved was something bigger. She needed an in to one of the large organizations she knew existed. One was called Solitaire, but there were others who operated more in the shadows with methods that were a little more subtle. That's where she needed to get a toehold, a start. Then she could work her way up, as long as she didn't blow her cover. She followed Chase up the stairs that terminated in the office above. He opened the door for her and she stepped inside. He remained on the landing outside. Inside, a man sat behind a desk, features set in granite. A large guard stood beside him, black head shaved bald over broad shoulders and a narrow waist. Former football player? She wondered. Behind the seated man was a large bank of monitors. When she faced the desk, the one-way mirror was behind her, and with a glance back, she saw that it did indeed offer a wide overview of the dance floor and the club below. Well? The man continued to stare at her. I'm curious about the room with the guard, she said simply. Chase told me whatever is back there is for members only, and I wondered about membership. What do you think is back there? I'm hoping there is some more expensive entertainment available. What kind of entertainment? I think we both know what I'm talking about. I need you to say it, Miss Quan, but you can call me Cynthia if you like. That's what my friends call me. Are we going to be friends, Cynthia? I certainly hope so. Do you have any ID? Janice slowly unzipped the tiny purse. She let it fall open a little so he could clearly see the stack of hundreds inside. She grasped the Nevada driver's license that bore her alias. It would pass any check they ran. The seated man handed it to the large guard. Check it out, Frederick, he said. He turned back to her. Have a seat while we wait. I apologize you did not have the chance to finish your drink. Do you want me to have Chase bring it up? Certainly, Mr. Ace. Everyone calls me Ace, even if they aren't my friends. He paused for a moment, put his hand to his ear, and said a few words she couldn't hear. Ace, is Chase your son? She asked when his attention was back on her. Why? Do you see any family resemblance? She'd have to be careful here. If she was right, Ace might not be his son's biggest fan. Not really. I was just wondering. He's my nephew, my sister's kid. He needs a job while he finishes his degree at UNLV. Interesting. Is he close? Close to what? Finishing. God, I hope so, Ace said. Just then Frederick returned with her license and nodded. Ace took it and handed it back to her. Just then the door opened and Chase walked in with a fresh martini. She took it from his hand. Thank you, she said, allowing a little purr to creep into her voice. Chase blushed and retreated. Ace reached into his desk and pulled a card out of a drawer and handed it to her. On one side was a symbol of some sort with a 21 in the center. The other side was an 8 of clubs. It was a little thicker than an average playing card. This will get you into the back room, he said. I assume you have an angle you're working, so there are rules. Don't rob my guests. If you wish to... He paused and looked her up and down. Entertain them in exchange for money or otherwise distract them, that is fine. If you're a gambler, there's a limit to what you'll be allowed to win regardless of how you're doing so. And if you lose... Ace stopped. He sat forward, and at the same time Frederick crossed his arms. If I lose? She said, trying to sound as innocent as she could. If you lose, you pay your debts right away. We can extend you credit, if need be, on a limited basis. But should you take too long to repay your loans, you'll find that we can be both aggressive and creative in our collection efforts. You understand? Of course, she said. I rarely lose, though. We'll see about that, Ace said. If you cause me any trouble, that membership can be revoked at any time. Understood, she said. Ace finally stood. Unlike Chase, he was short but well-muscled. His looks and manner radiated power. Best of luck, Cynthia, he said. The door opened and she was escorted out and down the stairs. She walked toward the guard and the locked door. Janice was in, and she intended to lose and lose big, but not right away. First, she needed to gather more information. Thanks for listening to the Solitaire series, Episode 11, the 8 of clubs. Next up in the series, the 10 of diamonds.